Hello, students. Let us discuss the poem, the first book by Amrita Pritam, which is prescribed for you in paper 8. Let me tell you something about the author. Amrita Pritam is a prominent Punjabi poet, novelist, and essayist of the 20th century. She was born in Pakistan. At the time of partition, her parents moved to India. She is well known both in India and Pakistan. Her works have been translated to almost all Indian and languages as well as foreign languages. Her works include poetry, fiction, biographies, essays, and collection of Punjabi folk songs. Her autobiography is also very famous. Several of her works have been made into movies. She rose to fame at a very young age when she penned the poem Aaj Aankhan Varishanu, or the Ode to Varisha. This poem was about the painful feelings or the sufferings of the people who experienced partition, who were victims, those who suffered because of partition. In this poem, Ode to Varisha, she expressed her anguish over massacres during the partition of India. I hope all of us are aware of what happened during the partition of India. There was widespread violence. People were killed during this particular incident. Women were raped, and trains which came from Pakistan to India were full of dead bodies. In the same way, the trains that went from India to Pakistan also carried dead bodies in them. She expressed her feelings of anguish, anxiety in this poem, Ode to Varisha. Amrita Pritam is well known for this poem. At the time of partition, many people were unhappy about this event. They all carried a copy of her this poem, Ode to Varisha, with them. And the government of India as well as the government of Pakistan have honored Amrita Pritam for her works. The most prominent awards that she received are the Sahitya Academy Award, Jnanapith Award, the Padma Shri, and the Padma Vibhushan. Now let us look at the title of this poem. It is the first book. The first book refers to the Vedas, in particular the Rig Veda. In this poem, the poetess Amrita Pritam talks about the status of women before the Vedas, that is, the prehistoric period, the period when people lived in forest as cave men and women, even before civilization, even before there was a language, even before anything what we call as modernity today came into existence. So she talks about that time when people lived happily in forests or wherever, in caves, and enjoyed equal status. According to the poetess, after the Vedas came into existence, women lost their status in society. They came to be ill treated, humiliated by the patriarchal society. So, the poem First Book is about the status of women before the Vedas or before the Rig Veda was written. Now let us look at the poem line by line. I was there, and perhaps you as well, standing perhaps a breath away. Here, in these two lines, the speaker talks about herself being with another person who is her friend or partner, and they both are standing very close to each other. She says, a breath away, so close that they could feel each other's breath. They were standing very close to each other, and they could feel the breathing of each other. So, in the first two lines, she says that she is standing or she is somewhere, and there is another person with her, and they are standing very close to each other. The next two lines, perhaps perched in the darkness of a vision, perhaps moving on a turning point of consciousness. So, when those two are standing together, at that time they were sitting on a tree. Now, perch is sitting on a tree like a bird does. So at that time they were sitting somewhere, perching somewhere in the darkness, and slowly beginning to gain awareness, slowly trying to understand the surroundings or the world around them. Moving further, we come to know that all this happened in the prehistoric times. When we read the next line, but that was a tale of prehistoric times. So, in the first stanza, the speaker narrates how life was in the prehistoric times, before the beginning of civilization, before language was invented. So she describes that period, the prehistoric period, when people did not have language to communicate with each other. They used only signs or gestures. Communication was possible even without a language. So she is talking about that period of time. Going to the next stanza, that was our existence, yours and mine, which became the first language of the world. So, language came into being only later. Human beings used to communicate with each other without language. Language came into existence only later. So, existence in the prehistoric times is further explained in these two lines. The speaker talks about how language came into existence. In the prehistoric times, people lived happily without any words, without any language, without any book which told them how to live. So, life in prehistoric times was managed very well by the people who lived in those times. They did not have any law books, they did not have any books containing rules and regulation in them. So, in the next lines, we read, words were coined to identify me, words were coined to identify you. Now, in these two lines, we read that they later, the prehistoric man and women were trying to form words. Now, slowly, they try to name things or trees or objects which they found around them. The prehistoric man and woman try to give name to a tree or a bird or an animal so that they could identify them. So they gave name to one another for the sake of identification. So, by these two lines, we understand that words were coined to identify people and other things. The purpose of words was identification. Groups of words formed a language. So, first they gave name to one tree or one bird or one animal. Later, these words together formed a sentence, and sentences formed a language. The first language of the world may have been formed in this way. So, how did language come into existence? Because people later on realized the need for language. So, slowly, as the vocabulary started building up, as they kept on adding words to the vocabulary, then language came into existence. The next line, and they wrote in that first language their first book. After language was developed, they started writing, they started recording. Before that, there was no means of writing. Now, as we all know, the folk literature, nothing is written, everything is in memory. But once a language started developing, writing also slowly began to emerge. And once they had a written form, books were written, and rules and regulations were written in the books, which began to control the life of human beings. In a sense, the speaker talks about evolution of language. How language came into existence is explained in this poem. How earlier communication took place in the form of actions and gestures. So, in the beginning, in the prehistoric time, we have seen this already. In the prehistoric time, communication took place in the form of actions and gestures. Later, words were added, words were used to identify things and people. Then, language came, and finally, writing came. So, here we have the sequence of how the language came into being. First, the prehistoric people started communicating with each other with bodily actions. That is, whenever they wanted to communicate something, they would make action or they would make some sounds. And later, the words came into being. They started using words for the sake of identification, identifying birds, animals, etc. And with the use of words, as more and more words started were coined, language came into being, and finally, the practice of writing began to take place. In the next few lines, we read, "That was our tryst, yours and mine. We slept on a bed of stones." In these lines, the author or the speaker narrates a romantic relationship between herself and her partner. Now, tryst means to have a romantic relationship. So, in the prehistoric time, they lived in the forest. So, they did not have any modern equipments or anything like sofa, furniture, or anything. So, they would sleep on the bed of stones. That is how they lived in the prehistoric time. And as we mentioned earlier, life was very happily led during those times. They did not have any problems as such. There was no power relations, etc. There was no social discrimination as such in those times, in the prehistoric times. Next lines, "And our eyes, lips, and fingertips became the words of your body and mine." In those times, they communicated in the form of touching one another, or through their eyes itself. It was such kind of communication took place before words. In this world, when there was no language, we are referring to the prehistoric time, man and woman enjoyed a very happy time. There was no discrimination or any kind of power relation. What do we mean by power relation? There is no superiority or inferiority. In the patriarchal society, men are considered to be superior and women inferior. So, in the prehistoric time, there was no such kind of a discrimination. There was equal status for both men and women. And the last line of this poem, the Rig Veda was compiled much later. So, several centuries later, Rig Veda was written. So, when we look at the history of those times, that is the Vedic time, we come to know that the customs and traditions degraded women during the time of Vedas or the Manusmriti. The women were degraded. They lost their status in society. They had no recognized place in society. Nobody recognized the work they did for the betterment of society. The great author Romila Thapar says, "The law books are both a reflection of early Indian society as well as attempts at working out what was believed to be a perfect social system." The law book that she refers here is the Manusmriti. In the Manusmriti, the women did it made Manu made such laws that women lost their freedom. They lost the status which they enjoyed so far. So, since we don't have any other reference regarding life in those times, we have to refer to the Vedas. They are a reflection of the early Indian society. Whatever information we can gather has to be taken from the Vedas, because we don't have any other document. whatever is there in the Vedas should be considered as the history of those times. So, what do we have in them? The women were degraded, humiliated. They did not have equal status with men. So, that is what we read from the Vedas. So, the patriarchal family became very powerful during this period, and it began to restrict the activities of women. So, at the time of Vedas, women who enjoyed a very happy life before the Vedas were degraded. They lost their freedom. They had to suffer. They were ill treated. So, this poem, the first book, refers to the life women enjoyed before the Vedas or the prehistoric time. How? Because there was no language, because there was no book, because there was no written document, nobody was there to dictate the status, their status in the society. Women lived happily, they enjoyed their freedom, they did not have any restrictions. I hope this will help you in your examination. All the best.